Good morning. This is Ann, and I'm all excited today. My nephew has this beautiful patch of mustard greens that are ready to pick. So I'm going to try my hand at canning mustard greens in jars. I normally freeze them, but we used to back in the day when my parents were gardening and I was a child. We actually canned greens in jars. So I'm going to pick these, and I already have a bucket full. Let me show you what I do. I just pinch the leaves off. That way you don't have to pull up the plants, and the plants just keep making and making, and they last a whole lot longer. I usually start as soon as they're big enough to eat. And I pull up a few plants so that I'm thinning when they're in places where they're too thick. But then later, when they get big, I just go through and pinch off really, the largest leaves. And the plants are left to continue growing. So when I get about 2 buckets full, and I've got one to go, I'll take them in and start the washing process. I now have the greens in the kitchen. I've got 2 dish pans. If anybody's ever tried to cook without a dish pan, I just don't understand how they would possibly do it. But it's one of my best kitchen utensils. Anyway, I have a dish pan in each of the 2 sinks, and I'm going to just start running cold water, tap water, into one of the pans and start putting the greens in until I have a dish pan full. You don't want to pack them in because we have to wash them, and we want to be able to work with them. Greens normally have a lot of sand in them. These are not too bad. I haven't noticed a lot of sand. My nephew has his garden mulched with straw. So while we're washing these greens, we're going to be checking to make sure we don't have any leaves in here, and we're going to check for bugs and hay and anything else that doesn't belong. Now, depending on how old and mature the greens are, when they're very young, you don't have to worry about removing the stems or spines or whatever you want to call them. But when they're a little bit bigger, and some of these are getting big now, you want to just take those stems or spines out. Just get rid of them because sometimes they're tough. So we're going to, especially in this first water or washing, we're going to pick through them carefully and take those stems out because they may be a little bit tough when you start to eat them. The smaller ones you don't have to remove. But we're going to wash these from one pan to the other. The first one we'll take all these out, and then we'll pour that water out, and then we'll fill this one up. We can be filling this one up as we're putting the greens into it. So what we're going to end up doing is washing these greens. They say 3 or 4 times, but I always wash mine at least 6 times, sometimes more. And how you're going to be sure that you don't have any sand or dirt in your greens is you can feel on the bottom of the pan And in the first pan that you don't feel any dirt or grit at all, then wash them one more time and you're finished. So however many times it takes, it depends on the garden and whether there's a lot of dirt on them. If it's rained and spattered the dirt up on them, there may be a little bit more, but these are not too bad. So we'll see how many times we have to wash these. But the next process after they're washed is the cooking process. So I'm going to finish washing these, and I'm sure you don't want to watch me wash every single one of them. We finally got all the greens washed, and we have this huge dishpan full, and it's all been through 6 rinses, so we're sure there's no sand or grit left in them. So now we need to continue with the process. So there's several things we need to do right now. On the stove, I started just a couple minutes ago. It's this stock pot, and it's 1/3 full of water, and we're going to have to put all the greens in there because they will reduce in size. So before we start the canning process, we've got to reduce these. So ideally we would put them in a steamer and steam them for maybe 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes. But I'm going to put them in water this time because that's the handiest thing for me to do with the equipment that I have right now. And so I'm going to start putting these greens into the pot. Just a few at the time, because it won't take them long to wilt. The water is boiling, so this should be quick. And the other thing that I did when I got through washing the greens was to check and wash all the jars. And what we're using for jars are these wide mouth pints. And the reason why I like to use the wide mouth jars for canning is that it has a 3-inch opening at the top, and it's much easier to get the food into. So we have our jars ready to go. Even though they're new jars, I still like to check them to make sure they have no nicks or cracks anywhere, either around the rim or any visible cracks in the jar itself. They can get broken in handling or transporting from the stove. Now I'm going to take a large spoon and stir the greens down so that we can add more to the pot. After we add quite a bit, it takes it a minute to come back to a boil. So we can add some more to the pot. And when we get all the greens in the pot, we'll cook them for about 5 minutes. Or if we were doing the steaming process, we'd steam them for about 5 or 6 minutes. While we're adding the greens to the pot, a few at the time, I'm going to start the jars. Even though I've already got them washed, checked and washed, I'm now going to put them on in a skillet. Here's my skillet that I've got about 1.5 inches of water in the bottom, and I'm going to start it boiling. And I'm going to add my jars into the pan. And when it comes to a boil, a full rolling boil, I'm going to let them boil for 10 minutes to sterilize them. Now for the purposes of canning, because we're using a pressure canner today, it's not necessary to sterilize the jars. But I always like to add that little extra layer of protection when you're canning vegetables. You need to be sure that you're killing all the bacteria that's naturally in the vegetables that you can, to avoid botulism, which would be a worst case scenario, because botulism is very dangerous. So to add that little extra layer of protection for my family, I like to sterilize my jars no matter what process I'm using. So I'm going to bring the water to a boil with the jars in it, and I started with 6. I think the greens will cook down enough so they'll fit in 6-pint jars, but we can add extras if we need to. So I'm going to continue putting these greens into the pot so that they can cook down a little bit. This is called a hot pack method. Some vegetables, when you can them, you can cold pack them, or that means putting them into the jars cold without cooking the vegetables or heating them beforehand. But greens are not vegetables that you can cold pack because of the volume. They do cook down, but if you put a jar full, by the time it was processed, you would only have a very small amount. So you have to wilt the greens first, and that's what we're doing here. So we're going to hot pack these. These are really pretty. They've just been picked, and that's really necessary if you're going to can something. Try to can it as soon after it's been picked as possible. Within 6 to 12 hours is the recommendation, because vegetables start to lose their nutrients, their vitamins and minerals, very shortly after they're harvested. So in order to prevent losing those nutrients, then you need to can them as soon as possible after you harvest them. That's hard to do when you have to buy your vegetables, but when you grow your own, then you have the option of picking right before you do the canning process. So it gives you a little extra boost there. You're able to preserve all the vitamins and minerals that you can preserve. So now we just have to wait a couple minutes till the greens are wilted and our jars are sterilized. Also, while we're waiting for the greens to finish cooking, we're going to put some water in a small saucepan on the stove and start it to boil. Put our lids in, because we need our jars, our lids, and our vegetables to all be hot when we put them together. That's part of the sterilization process. The new lids that they make these days really don't have to be boiled, but they need to be kept in hot water until we're ready to use them. While we're waiting, I wanted to show you the canner that I'm going to use today. Even though I prefer an electric canner, the one I'm using today is not electric. I'll use it it's a stovetop canner. And as you can see, it's quite large, and in the bottom it has a little rack to set the jars on, so they're not sitting on the bottom of the pot. So what I'm going to do is add about 2 to 3 inches of water, and I'm going to start it boiling. And my stovetop is quite full now with all the big pots. The water's boiling in the small saucepan now, so I'm going to turn the fire down a little so that it's still simmering. And I'm going to add my lids so that it'll be ready when we need them. Also, the jars are sterilized now and my greens have reduced. So it's time to fill the jars. So I'm going to use my funnel and a fork should do the trick. So I'm going to pull the pot over as close as I can get it. And start adding the greens to the jars. And we want to kind of pack them in there to get as many in as possible. Depending on the size of your family or the number of people who are going to be eating the greens, you could use quart jars. But I'm only using pints because that's the amount that I'll use at any one time. And if I have more people over, I can always open 2 jars. And you want to keep the jars hot while you're filling them, so you want to keep the flame on, the heat on under the burner while you're doing this. I'm going to continue to fill these while the water's starting to boil in the canner. So the big pan of greens that I had produced 6 pints. And you would think it would have been a lot more, but the greens just kind of cook down very low and the volume reduces. So what I'm going to do, and the directions that I follow say to use boiling water to fill up the jars, but I like to use the liquid from the pot where we cook the greens, and you fill the jars to within ½ inch. You only use a ½ inch, leave a ½ inch head space, so I'm not having to use very much. Okay, so now we're ready for our lids. We have to be sure the rims of the jars are clean before we put the lids on. So I get a clean cloth and we're going to wipe the rims of all of the jars very well. And I think I've gotten a little bit too much liquid in a couple of the jars, so I'm going to get rid of a little bit of it. Don't want to overfill them. We just need a quick wipe in case I spilled any. Now we're going to add our lids and rings. And I do have a tool, a lid lifter, to use for this purpose, keep from burning my fingers, but I don't have it with me, so I'm just using a fork. And then we're going to go ahead and turn the burner off underneath the pan where I had the lids. And we're going to add the rings. And so they are now ready to put into the canner. And we will process these for 70 minutes in the canner. And the water is just starting to boil in the canner. So I'm going to go ahead and add the jars. But now, if you live in an area that's, I believe it's more than 1,000 feet in elevation, then you would need to find out what the time is for that elevation, because elevation does affect the canning process. Now all canners are a little different, all the brands and types. Turn the water around. And center the pot on the eye of the stove, the burner. And I'm going to put the lid on. Make sure the gasket that's inside the lid is in there properly, that it's not twisted or out of place. When I finally figure this out, here we go, and get it in place, we're going to let it sit here until it builds up steam, and the steam will start coming out of this steam valve. And we'll let the steam escape for 10 minutes, and at that point then, after 10 minutes, we're going to put this little thing that goes on top of the steam valve, which is called a petcock. We're going to put it on and let the steam will continue to build up. And when it starts, this little thing will start rocking. And at that time, we start timing the process. And from the time the petcock starts rocking or making a noise or jiggling, I'm not sure exactly what this one will do, but we start timing and we process the greens for 70 minutes. So we're going to have the steam coming out just shortly. Steam has now been escaping from the escape valve on top of the pressure cooker now for 10 minutes. So it's time to put the petcock on. Alright, so we're supposed to use a 10-pound pressure, and we're supposed to process for 70 minutes. Okay, so when the petcock starts jiggling or whatever this particular one does, then we'll start timing our canning process. And we'll need to process it for 70 minutes. So it took approximately 5 minutes for the pressure to build up under the petcock, and it's making a noise now. So what I'm going to do is reduce the heat on the stove just a little bit. Now we don't need to turn it too low because we need to maintain the pressure that we've got up right now. So we have to set our timer now for 70 minutes. So obviously my beagle doesn't like the sound of the pressure cooker when the pressure is up. But we have to set our timer now to 70 minutes, and at that point we'll continue with the process. The 70-minute processing time in the pressure cooker for our mustard greens is now up. So the next step is to turn the heat off underneath the pressure cooker. I'm using a gas stove, so that means I just turn the burner off. But if you were using an electric stove or cooktop, then you would remove the pressure cooker from the heat source. So I've just turned the fire out. Now the thing to do is let it cool, let the pressure canner cool down. It will take a few minutes to do that. After it cools down, then we'll remove the petcock, or the little attachment that is on top of the steam vent. So at that point, then we'll wait 10 more minutes before we open it. But the next step now is just to wait until the canner cools down. Our canner is now cooled down, so the next step is I'm going to take the petcock off the top of the canner, and now we have to let it sit for 10 minutes before we take the top off. So now our 10 minutes are up, and we should be able to take a look at our finished product. See how our mustard greens are going to look. So here we go. And be careful with this because it's still hot. Alright, so here we are. As a matter of fact, they look absolutely beautiful. If you want to take a close look at them. So it looks like our process was successful. Here we have 6 pints of mustard greens, just out of the garden. So the last thing we need to do is to take all 6 of the jars out of the canner and set them aside in a prepared spot. Like I said, I usually keep a towel on one part of the countertop for just that purpose. And we have to leave them alone and just let them set for up to 24 hours so the jar lids will seal and we won't disturb them in any way. So thanks for stopping by and helping me with the canning today, and I hope to see you again soon. And if this video was helpful to you, please like and subscribe. Thanks again. We have to be sure the
Ah, ah.